Hello, everyone. I'm Fritz, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and welcome to Faculty Friday. Today's topic, gender justice and women's rights around the world with Professor Marie Berry. And let me wish everyone a happy International Women's Day. This topic is particularly timely, both because of the day, but of course, because of the moment we live in. This is part, of course, of a long struggle for women's rights around the world. And in this country, and a great opportunity for us to take stock of where we are, not only the progress, but also the things that are happening in the world as women seek to advance women's rights. I can't think of anyone better to have that discussion with than our own Professor Marie Berry. Dr. Berry is director of the Sié Chéou-Kang Center for International Security and Diplomacy here at the Korbel School, an associate professor. She's also the co-founder and director of and convener of the Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative, IGLI, an effort to elevate and amplify the work of that women or activists are doing at the grassroots level to advance peace, justice, and human rights across the world, something we'll talk about today. Her award-winning book, War, Women, and Power, From Violence to Mobilization in Rwanda and Bosnia-Herzegovina, Cambridge University Press, examined the impact of mass violence on women's political mobilization in Rwanda and Bosnia. Together with Dr. Millie Lake, she runs the Women's Rights After War Project, RAR, which we'll also talk about today. Dr. Berry's work has been published in so many places, like the Annual Review of Law and Social Science, Gender and Society, Democratization, Science, New Political Economy, Mobilization, Politics and Gender, Foreign Policy, Boston Review, The Monkey Cage, and Political Violence at a Glance. I'm probably more, Marie. She's a 2021 recipient of a very prestigious National Science Foundation Career Award. And I might add, a wonderful teacher and mentor here at the Korbel School. So welcome to Faculty Friday, Marie.
Thank you so much, Fritz. And it's wonderful to see so many of you in the Zoom room.
So Marie, your work has, broadly speaking, has been about women in war, women in conflict, how war affects women, the resilience of women victims of violence, and the status of women's rights after war, indeed the heroic work of women activists fighting for justice, and also, as we'll talk a bit about, feminist perspectives on conflict in IR. So we'll talk about all that, but let me just start with at the beginning. How did women in war become the focus of your work?
Oh my goodness. Thank you for that question. And it strikes me that there are a few different ways to answer that question. But maybe I can tell you a little bit of a story to give a little bit of context and background. And it's a story that sticks with me and that I tell relatively often when I speak to community audiences, because I think I can pinpoint this moment as a real turning point in my own career and in my own thinking about these topics. And it was a moment in 2008 when I was working in Rwanda. Prior to going to graduate school, I had actually graduated from university, having spent a lot of time working with Holocaust survivors during university. And then my first job after graduating from university was as the Speakers Bureau coordinator for the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle, where I'm from. And in my work with Holocaust survivors, I was struck time and time again with how many of them talked about how they hadn't actually told their stories. They hadn't really felt compelled to speak to public audiences themselves, because the Holocaust was relatively well acknowledged and well known, but they hadn't felt the kind of impetus or the motivation to speak until the Rwandan genocide happened. And it was in that moment that so many folks that had lived through these unfathomable horrors during the Nazi Holocaust experienced the world again turning a blind eye towards these egregious forms of violence and harm. And so it was sort of in those conversations with Holocaust survivors that I actually found myself in Rwanda for the first time. And when I was there, I was prepared for the astounding loss and grief that the country and all of its citizens had gone through just 13 years before my first trip there. And the sense of the genocide was palpable everywhere you walked through the cities, through the rural areas. There were purple banners marking sites of massacres. There were cases of, or there were, monuments that featured the kind of remains of people that had been killed. And I was, in some ways, I was expecting to experience this country in just a little bit after the first decade after it had experienced this unbelievable event. But what I wasn't prepared for in that trip to Rwanda was these stories of women who had experienced tremendous loss and who had personally witnessed or been the victim of forms of violence that I can't even imagine. And instead of finding their way, spending their days full only of grief or full only of trauma, they were oftentimes taking bold and courageous steps to actually build opportunities for those in their communities to have a better future and to try to find ways to rebuild and to creatively think about how they might actually take care of each other more fully than what had happened in the past. And there's a story of a woman named Esther, who is a sister of one of my dearest Rwandan friends, who really on one day in 2008 really kind of epitomized this duality of these kind of two truths of war, which is one of tremendous devastation and the other of it revealing a strength that I think women oftentimes hold, that we see shine through in these moments of deep tragedy. And Esther's story was a very simple one, and it was a common one in some ways, where she had witnessed the targeted killing of her father, followed by her mother, followed by most of her siblings. And when Esther ran from the site of this attack, she ended up hiding, and she ran and ran and ran until she found a well. And she climbed down into the well and actually spent the next few weeks hiding right above the water line, able to drink clean water, which kept her alive, but also, completely shut off from everything that was happening above as the genocide unfolded. And eventually Esther was rescued. And as she returned to her home, her family home, as really the only one of two survivors in her family, she found it completely looted and completely, it was destroyed. The home was destroyed. And she described to me the first time I met her how that day she decided that what she really wanted was the comfort and the nourishment of being able to sleep horizontally on a bed. And Esther began to find ways to gather bits of grass, bits of fabric, and she began to make a mattress for herself and slowly made mattresses for so many of the other orphans that lived in her neighborhood. And as she was able to make these mattresses, she began to kind of emerge as a leader in her community in doing this work of finding ways to care for these orphans and other folks that had lost everything during the genocide. And eventually Esther became a kind of a respected member of her community. She joined the gacaca courts as a judge. She became quite successful in business. And she, to me, to this day, represents this duality of a different sort of war story, a story of profound courage, of creativity and resilience that doesn't take away from the loss and the tragedy and the horror that she experienced, but I think that in some ways can remind us of powerful characteristics that human beings and women in particular have in these moments of deep tragedy and loss. So it's those stories, I think, that have motivated my career ever since and have really guided the work that I've done in many places across the globe, which seeks to understand both the grief and the loss of armed conflict and genocide, alongside the way in which these moments of great upheaval oftentimes reveal a deeper humanity and a deeper sense of creativity and courage that I find to be very hopeful and very affirming, especially in this moment where there's so much grief in the world.
Yeah, oh, I love that. And thank you for sharing that story. And it's one of the things I love about your work is I've been reading it, preparing for this. Your ability to listen and to get people to tell the stories, and then the sharing of their voices in your work, which is not all that common in academia. And really powerful. Really picking up on this theme about resilience, which is, quite extraordinary. One of your recent publications is entitled "Radicalizing Resilience." And what's as you just said, it's you did, first of all, you did incredible field work in Nepal and Rwanda and in Bosnia, in Palestine and Israel, talking to women, extraordinary number of women who had suffered atrocities and violence and conflict. And as you were saying, it's not. I mean, it's horrible, but it's not just a horror story. It's really a story of as you just told, of resilience. But the argument you make, which I think is really interesting, is that resilience is often thought of as kind of a solitary act. It's something that an individual does. But you really emphasize the process of becoming resilient. And that process is not a solitary process. It's one that's really relational and having to do. So talk a bit about that perspective that you bring to this, really this phenomenon of women who've suffered terribly being able to be, to have hope and to move on, as you've just described.
No, thank you for that thoughtful read also of the paper and of the question. To those listening, the paper that Fritz is referring to was actually written in some ways in a little bit of protest, because I always get asked in this very affirmative way, oh, well, it's amazing how resilient people are. And I think what I've learned over the years and what I've come to really find to be deeply, difficult is that, I would like to live in a world where people didn't have to be resilient, right? Where people actually don't have to, to find ways of standing in the face of egregious harm. And there are scholars and folks from certain communities that have really, I think, emphasized this. For instance, a lot of Palestinian scholars who have said, we are really sick of people celebrating our resilience, right? We don't want to have to be resilient anymore. And I think that is a really powerful and important framework to kind of come to the conversation with resilience about. So what I tried to do in this piece, and what I think I tried to do broadly in my work, is to think about, holding that critique in my own head and understanding that I would love it if I don't think there's anything really to be celebrated in an individual's resilience, because it says that the systems that they are living within are ultimately unjust and violent systems. And I would, again, I would love it if they didn't have to be resilient. But at the same time, we oftentimes think of resilience as something that individuals have, as kind of a characteristic of individuals, or even of people, right? We sometimes talk about the people there are resilient, right? And I've been incredibly lucky to do a lot of fieldwork and interviews with women who've lived through violence in many different parts of the globe. As you mentioned, you could add Colombia and Uganda and Kenya and other places to that list as well. And what strikes me in these hundreds and hundreds of interviews that I've done with women who've lived through war is that when they talk about their process of surviving, right? When Esther talked about her process of surviving and finding ways to heal, it is never in isolation. It is never as an individual upholding or resisting some sort of violence. In fact, it's oftentimes so deeply relational that we might think of it as more of these ecosystems and webs of caring relations that ultimately lead to people's ability to thrive and survive and even thrive in these contexts. And so in this piece, I pull out really three sort of types of relationships that I think structure people's process of being resilient or becoming resilient in the face of life-destroying violence. And I talk about, one of the things I talk about is very close to my own kind of heart and home as well, which is this idea of mothering. And not the idea of motherhood as a relation, as an individual kind of identity of a bearing of child and raising a child, right? But of mothering as the act of actually working to care for individuals in these contexts who have been targeted for some form of harm or even elimination. And I draw a lot in this framing from Black feminist thinkers in the United States who have talked about what it's like to mother Black men in the US in the context of these kind of legacies of racial violence that we've seen historically throughout this country. And many of these scholars have talked about the kind of political work that becomes inherent in trying to create the survival of a human being in a context in which they are going to be experiencing structures and people and institutions who wish to harm them, or even not intentionally, but structurally can harm them. And so I take this concept and really think about what it means for a woman in Bosnia, for instance, who is raising a Bosniak or a Muslim son in the context of the Bosnian War. What does it mean to raise a child when the opposition group would like to actually cleanse your family, right, from the land that you've lived on for generations and move you to a different place? And if you don't go, we are going to kill you in that process, right? What does it mean to mother somebody that is actually being targeted for abuse, right? That is I think, a very political process, and yet we think of it as something, I think, that is almost like a natural thing that women in particular do. And I think what I'm trying to invite us is to consider, where that work is politically constitutive and formative. And I also talk, beyond mothering in that piece, I talk a lot about the power of solidarity and how, in many of the communities that I've worked in and many of the folks I've learned from who have been affected by profound violence and war, including many of the Holocaust survivors that I worked deeply and closely with in my earlier career, what people will oftentimes say is that they found a type of community which scholars have talked about as a kind of solidarity of the shattered, of people that have lived through some sort of harm and direct violence against their lives, that then can really almost put into perspective everything else that they experienced in their life. And that when you find other people who have also been, have experienced that shattering, there's a deep connection. And there's also a deep ability, I think, to have to find, and I don't pretend that this is universal, but I heard often from people a deep ability to find a gratitude for what they didn't experience when they can learn and hear from what other people did. And I've heard this from women in Nepal, women in Rwanda and Bosnia, who can say, I thought what happened to me was really terrible, and then I met somebody else. And when I learned what she had lived through, it gave me a sense that actually, it is on me now, right, to work to care for her and to figure out how we can be in kind of solidarity with each other as we grapple with these different experiences of harm that have shaken us, right, in very different but powerful ways. So I think that's really where I'm coming from in this piece. And I'll just kind of finish by saying that there's a third theme that I unpack around care and mutual aid, and the way in which in these contexts you see a lot of the ability of people to survive in war oftentimes comes down to systems of mutual aid, of people bringing a little bit more water back from the water pump, right? People sharing a little bit of that ration that was just distributed, things that are about finding ways to tend to the bodies of other people in loving and caring ways. And I think that is, again, a way of emphasizing that relational quality of resilience that really belies much of the the critiques of resilience as a neoliberal or a very individualistic type of framework. And so I just, that work is really an invitation kind of to rethink how we treat and understand that concept.
Yeah, no, I think it's a lovely and powerful framing that you give to that, and the ways in which people transcend the victimhood and become positive, find hope and are able to move forward. It's really wonderful. Let me and I was remiss at the outset in not telling our audience that we will have time for Q&A. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. As you can see, I would gladly talk to Marie for hours, but we do want to be sure to get to your questions as well. So put them in there. Let me turn to another line of work I mentioned in the introduction, the Women's Rights After War project that you do jointly with Dr. Millie Lake from the London School of Economics. It's a big project. There's a lot still ongoing, as I understand it. But in particular, you I had the pleasure of reading your article on women's rights after war. And this is part of, war is horrible, but it is also often thought of as a moment of opportunity to advance women's rights. And you're really looking at the question of, well, is that really having an effect on the ground? And I thought it was fascinating, kind of nuanced take on this, and that on the one hand, one does see improvements often, not always, I'm sure, in representation, in property rights, and other sort of legal forms of rights. And yet, the reality on the ground is far less than the promise. Yeah. So I'd love to sort of draw you out on sort of why it is that these advances and the sort of symbolic advances, I guess, or the legal advances don't translate more thoroughly into or more completely into the actual experiences of women.
Yeah, I thank you again. It's a joy to get such smart questions from somebody who's read some of these projects. And I start that article with this anecdote of when Millie and I began this collaboration now 13 years ago, where we were both conducting research for our dissertations, and we quite literally met in a restaurant in Kigali, Rwanda, where we were talking about what we were working on to each other as we just met. And we found that she was working in the Democratic Republic of Congo at a moment in 2011 where there was tremendous insecurity and instability, ongoing displacement and rebel activity that was approaching towns and leading to massive massacres. And yet, what she found in the justice system is that even in Congo, which is one of the least institutionalized places in the world, you actually had opportunities for women to get some form of legal justice around their experience of sexual and gender-based violence, and especially wartime rape, because of the creation of these mobile courts. And these mobile courts were this really innovative opportunity for people to think about how you didn't need a formal kind of court system to be able to actually go to a community and try to address the harms that people had experienced. Just a couple hundred miles away in Rwanda, where I was doing work, Rwanda had elected first in 2003, and then in 2008, and then in 2012, the world's highest percentage of women into its parliament, and had reformed much of the governing apparatus of the state in a way that was consistent with a firm commitment to women's rights and gender equality. And this looked like a political quota system. It looked like a ministry devoted to mainstreaming gender throughout the government. It looked like strong kind of gender provisions in the court process coming out of the genocide. But what we were both finding, kind of as we were swapping notes, was that we saw this progress, and it was very much real. And at the same time, we were speaking to so many women who had yet to experience the benefits of that progress in their own lives. And so this project comes about through that early real desire to look at how these moments of war and upheaval can be both spaces for building the institutional and political frameworks that can create more gender equality, while also asking who's benefiting from the implementation of all of those rights and frameworks aimed at getting women into politics, into power, into justice. And so the Women's Rights After War project is a massive 6-country comparative project. We look at Rwanda and Bosnia, Sri Lanka, Colombia, Nepal, and Iraq. And over the past 4 years, we've engaged in a series of very different methodological approaches to try to understand these questions. And all 6 of those countries had wars in the last couple of decades that ended with transitions that prioritized the inclusion of women in the transitions from war to peace. And so you have countries like Colombia, who are kind of well known now as having incredibly gender sensitive peace agreements that then became part of the constitution. You have countries like Iraq and Bosnia, who both had federal systems emerge from the kind of power sharing, who also implemented a suite of gender sensitive reforms. You have reforms that range from family law reforms to extend inheritance rights to women, or to criminalize marital rape or spousal violence, all the way to these very visible political gender quotas that are aimed at kind of securing a certain set of seats in the national legislature for women. So it's true, and my first book looked at this, that war is a transformative period of social disruption that is both destructive as well as profoundly kind of catalytic for the building of new institutional norms and frameworks. And those norms and frameworks can indeed be centered on politics of inclusion. They can be inclusive of gender, they can be inclusive of racial and ethnic minorities, they can be inclusive of political opposition. There's a lot of ways in which that moment of transition from war to stability is a really important juncture for thinking about building more like inclusive, peaceful democracies. Unfortunately, throughout the project, what we found is that the story across all of these cases has been really mixed. And it's mixed for a few different reasons. One of the ways that it's mixed is that you see that that certain regimes, and especially regimes that are characterized as more autocratic or authoritarian regimes, have actually picked up on this idea that advancing women can be a really good smokescreen for the fact that they'd like to consolidate power behind an ethnic minority or a political party that has control over the state. And so you see that happening in places like Rwanda as the really kind of the archetypal example of when a state has a real kind of authoritarian tendency, and whose regime is consolidated really in an undemocratic way by a single political party. The advancement of women in some ways serves to kind of distract attention away from the fact that there's an ethnic minority group that's controlling the political system in Rwanda. But we also see this in more kind of subtle ways, especially at the subnational level, in places that you still have a lot of contestation around the dynamics of the war. So in places like Colombia or Nepal, where you have a power sharing agreement that brings about the end of the war and actually brings the rebel group into the government, you actually see the way in which women at the local level sometimes are the members of their family who don't actually have allegations against them for committing crimes in the war. So they're representing their husbands or their fathers or their brothers who are unable to run for political office because they have criminal charges against them from what happened in the conflict. And so this kind of extension of rights to women almost creates a new terrain on which the dynamics and kind of tensions of the conflict can continue to play out, but in this space of building inclusive democracies, rather than in a war kind of a clear kind of arena where the war was in some ways fought, through formal politics or through the kind of the battlefield. And I think that should, in some ways, not cause us to lose hope that the inclusion of women in politics is a deeply essential and important, goal in the future. But I think it really begs us to pause that if we advance women without considering the other intersecting identities that women represent and occupy, whether it's their political affiliation, their family networks, their relationship to narco groups or cartels or other illicit economies, their corporate relationships, their other kind of ethnic politics relationships. If we think about women's advancement in this kind of what Millie and I have termed single access organizing around the access solely of gender, we risk the way in which the extension of rights to women can actually create new opportunities for those other dynamics to play out, oftentimes under the surface, and with very deeply worrisome implications for the long-term implications of peace. Because if we see the kind of ongoing contestation playing out in this other arena that a lot of international feminists like to celebrate, we're actually missing the way in which this can erode the kind of the durability of the post-war political settlement and the possibilities of building that inclusive liberal democracy. So that was one of the most kind of like, in some ways, difficult of the findings of this project. But there's some more hopeful findings as well.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it really makes the point that while those legal and other reforms may be necessary, they're hardly sufficient, and that and of the importance of activities at the grassroots level, looking much more closely at how things actually play out. That work is sort of describing the phenomenon. Let me turn to the work you've been doing with women activists around the world who are doing the work of trying to advance women's rights in these contexts that you just described, and other contexts as well. I mentioned in the intro IGLI, the Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative that you lead, which brings together and has brought together now over several years women activists from around the world who are often doing not just difficult but dangerous work in their communities. And I should flag that you have an upcoming IGLI Mexico. We're
10 days.
In 10 days, fantastic.
Yeah.
For those and which is bringing together, I think, women from the hemisphere who are engaged around the world. I mean, really, I think it'd be great to hear some of the stories. I've been just so impressed with the people I've had the occasion, the honor and opportunity to meet. Just the kind of bravery and tenacity that so many of these women demonstrate in their work in their own countries. Talk a bit about what you've learned from that, the kinds of people, and maybe some of the stories that really have inspired you.
Yeah, thank you. It stems directly from the previous question as well, because what the more hopeful stories are is that in every one of these countries, right, that we're looking at that are going through these transitions from war to more, hopefully more durable long-term peace, we see the limits of some of these formal, institutionalized, oftentimes elite projects aimed at women's empowerment or women's leadership. But we see the limitations there, but we also see the absolute dynamism of grassroots women across the world that are fighting every single day, right now, right on the front lines, to build more peace and justice in their communities. And I think the research has really given us the motivation to do this, because what we know from a lot of studies that have come out of women's leadership and women's empowerment is that women's leadership in formal institutional spaces, such as in politics, only really trickles down and manifests in gender justice and change for women more broadly if there's a corresponding connection between that elite politics and the grassroots. And that those grassroots movements that are happening have to be able to hold those elite politicians accountable and to push for things that matter to their communities. And it's in the robustness of those grassroots movements that we really see, I think, the real kind of backbone and the real future of women's rights movements around the world. And so for IGLI, for the last 7 years, we've just been so fortunate at Korbel to be able to convene this program. And I just think that this program is so important because it's all about elevating, amplifying, and strengthening the work that women are doing on the grassroots around the world to advance peace and justice. And we've held 6 now institutes where we've brought activists from all over the world. We have more than 100 alums now from more than 44 countries. And these activists are folks who are, doing everything from, I'll name Frida Nabarema, for instance, who's an activist from Togo, who has been working in exile to try to advance both women's rights and democracy in what is Africa's longest running dictatorship. The same family has been controlled for the longest period of time in Togo. We've got people like Ketekandre Andarafitosin, who I speak of often, who is an incredible anti-corruption campaigner from Madagascar, who was a judge who constantly was finding in Madagascar that she couldn't actually adjudicate any sort of case without there being a tremendous amount of pressure from different interest groups. And that pressure was not small. It was actually in terms of, bullying to the point of actual threatening her life and other people's lives and their families. And this endemic sort of feeling of corruption in Madagascar politics motivated Kay to actually think about how we do public education and broader kind of learning around the fact that it doesn't have to be like this, right? There can be a social contract that we create with other people in our community that is built on mutual respect and care. And so for the last years, Kay has been using civil resistance techniques and other creative techniques like theater and participatory theater to try to help folks in Madagascar learn about the alternatives to thinking about corruption as kind of normal. We've got amazing people, including 2 remarkable activists that came to IGLI in 2019 from Colombia, Yaneth and Simone, who are both queer Afro-Colombian organizers from the Pacific region of Colombia, who have identified that there's a profound need to think about intergenerational healing, building solidarity, especially in communities that have been harmed and marginalized in Colombia, and thinking about just ways of maintaining kind of vibrant traditions. And so they've done their activism by building spaces for community to gather. And in moments like a couple years ago, when there was massive protests and then a lot of police crackdowns in Cali, Colombia, these spaces have become nodes for actually articulating what Afro-Colombians want and what they are, seeking in terms of the way in which the state and other leaders are relating to them. And I find that these stories, are endless. I could tell you these stories for days. And in fact, if anyone is interested in those stories I just told you, we actually recorded a podcast featuring these stories because I don't think they get told enough. And the courage and creativity of these folks is just astounding. The IGLI workshop that we're hosting starting next week is featuring women identified activists from across Latin America. It will be held in Spanish. And the 18 activists that are coming to the workshop have all been experiencing increased repression against their work, including major violent backlash against human rights defenders. Many of them are coming from contexts like Honduras or Nicaragua, which has seen a decline in democracy and a real uptick in violence against especially environmental activists, feminist activists, marginalized groups, etc. And so our goal by trying to convene them in a space together is to provide an opportunity for learning from each other, for building solidarity, to enable that kind of resilience to be cultivated of them as individuals, but also as their movements, as they return to their respective struggles and actually think about how we continue going in the face of these new threats and these increased repression. And so I'm constantly, holding that kind of feeling of deep grief about the world, and yet seeing the remarkable creativity that people are, and boldness that people are engaged in all over the world, and finding that to be very grounding and finding some sort of hope in our future.
Yeah, no, it's very inspirational. And particularly, as you say, at a moment where it looks like in many contexts, there's a backlash or a retreat from so it's never a linear path in terms of the progress of women's rights, for sure. And I suppose particularly encouraging in a moment where it does feel a bit like there's at the global level, like there's a bit of retrenchment, that there's people doing the kind of work that you describe. I'm conscious of time, and I know that I want to get to a question. So let me. I'm going to ask one more question, and I want to just widen the aperture a little bit.
Yeah.
Because your focus is here. You're even broader than the conversation we've had so far, and so I wanted to highlight the upcoming Feminist Peace Summit, which you're organizing, which will take place here at the Korbel School in May. Is that right?
May 1st through 3rd.
1st through 3rd, and it's really about the whole phenomenon of feminist peace studies, or an effort to create a feminist IR, and you know, to both think differently and to imagine different ways of engaging, and sort of at a very fundamental level about the nature of conflict, the nature of war in societies. It could hardly be more timely in a you know, a moment where there is more visibly you know, war and conflict around the world. We're in a world that's been dominated and continues to be dominated by men, sometimes quite belligerent, strong men in various places. I'd love to hear more about what the summit is, and the kind of intellectual agenda that lies behind it.
No, thank you for giving me the opportunity to chat about it and to formally announce it, because we really just launched the official invitations yesterday. The Feminist Peace Summit will be held from the 1st through the 3rd of May at the Korbel School, and it's a collaborative project of both IGLI at the Sié Center, as well as 3 amazing partner organizations that include MADRE, Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, and Women Cross the DMZ. And those 3 movements have been working together for the past 4 years on what they call the Feminist Peace Initiative. And they articulated a really bold vision for what feminist peace must look like, with a 2020 document, called A Vision for Feminist Peace, what a movement-driven foreign policy should look like.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of this document was, how do we take the movements at the grassroots and have them plug in and inform the way in which US foreign policy in particular is engaging in all these places around the globe? And I think after we planned to do this summit, there became a real urgency with it, because what we are seeing, of course, especially with what's going on today in Gaza, but as well as what's happening in Sudan and in Democratic Republic of Congo and other places where we're seeing ongoing, protracted, incredibly devastating violence and war and genocide, right? And in those contexts, what we're I think what we are trying to, and we're, by the way, in addition to those, those really active wars, we have this escalation of tensions between the US and China. We have, this ongoing struggle with Iran. We have a devastating situation in Haiti. And what we know is that diaspora movements in the United States from all of those places have been organizing to try to really have a stronger voice towards US policymakers as they're deciding how the US, oh my gosh, look at that.
What did that?
I don't know why that happened, but
that was impressive. Yes,
that was special. That was like a real celebration. I think
new
maybe
special effects here on Faculty Friday. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, a little AI action if I gesticulate too wildly, apparently. But let me just, the idea is, with these diaspora communities that are, they're so many of them are organizing for a change in US foreign policy towards their homelands. And the change that many are advocating for is a divestment in military responses and an investment in diplomacy, in building relationships, in finding ways to actually create channels of dialogue, so that there is a possibility of de-escalating these tensions and creating more stability and more security in the world. And ultimately, that is should be in the interest of every single feminist on this planet, right? A more peaceful world is a world in which feminists are actually, achieving the work of ending systems of violence that have been affecting so many people around the world, for since time immemorial. And I think what we're doing with the Feminist Peace Summit, ultimately, if I could sum it up, is to try to put that conversation around peace and around challenging war together with feminist movements, and to really say that feminist movements that are working, especially in the feminist foreign policy space right now, have to have peace at the center of their agenda. And to have peace at the center of their agenda will require us to think about what a feminist response then to ongoing crises and climate and conflicts in the world would consist of. What does it mean to have a feminist foreign policy towards Iran, towards Haiti, towards Korea, right? And I think that we really aspire to use the summit to bring academics, activists, policymakers, philanthropists, community members, and other folks together to really think about what does it mean to build a feminist foreign policy for peace? How do community groups and movements have to organize together to be able to get that affected and to have that change happen? And then what do all of us in our respective disciplines and our respective works, what can we do now, especially in the lead up to the 2024 election? And kind of given all of the grief and the crisis in the world today, what can we do now to actually demand and hold accountability and demand accountability from policymakers that they move towards diplomacy and move away from war? And I think I feel very excited, and I feel very, I feel like, in some ways, just like resilience, I wish we didn't have to be having these conversations. And I wish it wasn't as urgent and feeling like the stakes were as high as it does. But I think in this moment, I think it's a powerful opportunity to cohere our voices together to really demand a more peaceful approach to all of the different conflicts that are going on in the world right now.
I think, it's a fabulous initiative. It'll be a fabulous event. All of you in the audience, stay tuned for more information about it. May 1st through 3rd here at the Korbel School. So I did promise that. So I would love to keep selfishly keep asking the questions, but I did promise to turn to the audience, and so let me do that in the minutes we have left here. So a question from an anonymous attendee. I really love the research approach of framing women survivors as more than monolithic victims of suffering. They're advocates, caretakers, and all kinds of shades of gray between. What has it been like for you to carve out space in the canon on human rights to explore how women uniquely experience genocide and / tragedy in opposition to people who might say, well, everyone experiences genocide regardless of gender?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so it's such a great question because in my gender classes, I would always start by saying, everybody experiences war in gendered ways, right? And that includes men. We know that men and boys are more likely to actually experience being killed during war. And there are many examples of, sex selective massacres of men, Srebrenica in Bosnia being one of the most famous ones, in which really 8,000 men and boys were killed and women were actually spared. At the same time, we know that women and gender and sexual minorities as well experience war and experience vulnerability in particularly gendered ways. And so I think we can't really understand the dynamics of war without thinking through a gendered lens. And I would also add that we can't really understand the dynamics of gender without also including conversations around race and class and other forms and categories of difference. And so, I think for my own, how have I carved out space kind of within the discipline and the academy, kind of trying to think about these things. Unfortunately, I don't find it hard to convince people that the gendered story of armed conflict matters. And I think we see that time and time again when we see these different forms of gendered harms showing up in the way in which wars are enacted.
Great. Thank you for that. And this from a fan, apparently, Dr. Avantika Singh.
So,
a
fan / my personal hero, because
of course, Dr.
she's
Berry, thank you for the talk. As always, so refreshing to hear you speak. France has recently become the first country to enshrine abortion rights in its constitution. It looks like the EU might follow. I even read an article called "America Isn't Cool Anymore, Just Ask the French." If you could talk briefly about how having universal abortion rights rather than looking at it as a pro-life / pro-choice dichotomy, especially given our given war, GBV context like Haiti, is important.
Yeah. First of all, Avantika, hi, and thank you. You're a gem and always asking thoughtful and great questions. Avantika has been tremendously involved in a lot of this work around IGLI and also with planning the Feminist Peace Summit. What I would say is that, and actually this speaks to another question that's also in the chat about, we're talking a lot about overseas where we can talk about a gender war at home. And I feel this very strongly. I think, the what Fritz alluded to in terms of this kind of trend of the rolling back of rights for women. And of course, I think beyond women, for sexual and gender minorities, especially, and also for other marginalized communities, we see this trend happening, at really broad levels over the past 17 years, kind of, explicitly documented by Freedom House in terms of the decline and the indicators of democracy across the globe. And the United States is no different, right? We are under a tremendous, attack on gendered rights and women's rights and people that are born females' rights in this moment, right? We are looking at remarkable, deeply worrisome bills against trans kids and gender affirming care in so many parts of this country. We've seen, the rollback of Roe v. Wade and the elimination of abortion as a protected right, and the way in which particular states have actually, like Alabama recently, with the absolutely mind-blowingly bonkers conceptualization of a fertilized egg as a child with the same rights of a child. This is an incredibly worrisome trend that has profound implications not only for women, but for just the status of all human beings in this planet, and I think the strength of our democracy more broadly. I always say to my students that the bedrock of security is reproductive autonomy. You cannot have security at a global, at a national, at that level without having people having sovereignty over their own bodies. And that includes the right to, control one's reproductive system. And if we're losing that, right, I think it has very, very worrisome trends for long-term, the long-term ability of our world to move towards a place in which more people have freedom and the ability to thrive. And so, of course, what France did this last week, is incredibly encouraging to me. I'm happy to see it. I also think you talk to our European counterparts and they'll say, I can't believe that this is such a big deal in the United States. This has just been a settled issue for so many countries in Europe and elsewhere for so long because it's very much seen as healthcare. And I think one of the frames that I think is very important to think about is how it is healthcare, of course, but it's also the withholding and the rolling back of rights is also a form of state violence because it's a way in which the state begins to permeate the kind of sovereign bodies of its constituents. And I just think that is a very, very difficult and a very worrisome subject. What can we do in Colorado and what's going on right here? I mean, I think hopefully everybody's aware that there's a ballot initiative that needs 180,000 signatures by April, I think 15th or something like that, to try to get reproductive care onto the ballot in November that would create a constitutional amendment in Colorado specifically that would enshrine the right for reproductive rights, especially if there are going to be trends at the national level in which that changes. I think everybody can get involved in that, where there's a push over the next couple of weeks to really get that on the ballot and to mobilize like other states have done to really protect that right. And I think that's just one of many things, because of course reproductive rights is one of many ways in which you see the kind of erosion of rights for women. And I would just say that these are not always around reproduction, right? We see the erosion of rights for women from marginalized communities in terms of their voting rights. We see the erosion of rights for people in so many different ways right now. And I think it's incumbent on us as students and as community members who care about the world to really look to see what's happening right here in the US, as a way of understanding, I think, the urgency and the way in which these trends across the world do not happen in isolation. They oftentimes happen in conversation with each other. And so we can learn, I think, from Argentina and from Ireland and from Colombia, in terms of how those struggles in the last few years did successfully actually extend reproductive rights to folks in those communities or in those countries.
Thank you for that. And we are running short on time. And I think we probably asked one more question. So and apologies to those who put questions that we won't be able to get to. But question from Adma Narantunalag, whose last name I probably butchered, and I apologize. But it's really a question you think a lot about, I think. What do you think of some of the important things that need to be done to improve the collaboration between top elite women in power and the grassroots women in these countries?
I think that's a beautiful question, Odma. Thank you so much. Odma's an incredible postdoc at the Korbel School, for those of you who haven't met her. And yeah, we're just so lucky to have her here for the last couple of years, a year and a half. Odma, what can we do? I mean, I think that one of the things we need to do is visibilize the stories of women at the grassroots who are doing this courageous work. When we look at the front page of the New York Times, right, I don't see the kind of incredible, powerful, tireless work that so many people are doing. And so some of it is about storytelling. Like, I think I see my role oftentimes as trying to just tell the stories of the people that are doing this work in a way that helps us understand that these aren't just feel-good stories, right? These are not just stories designed to give you some hope. They're actually stories about what we need to cultivate in order to build more durable, peaceful, and inclusive societies. We will not be able to counter these worrisome trends in terms of the decline of democracy across the globe and the rise of autocratic politics and the decline of so many of these rights that have been extended to marginalized communities that are now under threat. We will not be able to stem that tide unless we really invest in the way in which community power and has to be sort of galvanized, mobilized, and supported to be able to hold the line in these moments of crisis and in these moments of threat. So I think one of it is about visibilizing this work. Another is about not actively undermining it, right? So there's been a lot of, I think, in some ways, and I've written about this a bit, but there's been, some I think dynamics where we see the pitting of different groups against each other's in ways that are ultimately demobilizing for them. And I think that's, a really difficult topic, and I think a difficult pattern. We also, I think, really need to recognize that elite politics and grassroots politics, should be finding spaces of collaboration. And what we've heard, especially in organizing this Feminist Peace Summit, is that oftentimes sitting members of Congress will say, we actually need the movements at our back to be able to hold the line for these difficult conversations in Congress. If the colleagues in Congress don't see the way in which so many people are galvanized at this moment, to demand a ceasefire in Gaza, right? Or to right now, a lot of mobilization around, trying to hold the Biden administration accountable. I think, it's very difficult for policymakers to push these things unless they see that there's a groundswell of people at their back. And so, I think it is about doing the work of making sure we see and we support and we fund and we resource that type of organizing and that type of women's leadership as well.
That's great. Well, Odma, my apologies. I both mispronounced your first and last names. Thank you for that great question. Let me just thank all of you in the audience for being with us today, and very particular thanks to Professor Marie Berry for such an engaging and thoughtful and in many ways inspiring conversation. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for all the work that you're doing. And with that, I'll look forward to seeing all of you at the next Faculty Friday.
Thank you so much, and happy International Women's Day to all of you.
Indeed. Thank you all.